Good morning and thank you for joining us as we read part 2 of Keeker and the Sugar Shack. Last week we read chapters 1 and 2, so this week we will finish with chapters 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 3. The next morning the rain had stopped. It was another almost sunshiny day and Keeker woke up with a plan. She knew exactly what she needed to do: investigate. "Mom," she said in her most sugary sweet voice, "would it be okay if I take Plum out again? Can we go by ourselves this time? Please, please, please." Mrs. Dina was always a little suspicious of the sugary sweet voice. "Well, okay," she said after a pause, "as long as it doesn't rain." When Keeker got down to the barn, Plum was standing out by her water trough, sunning herself. Her eyes were closed and her whiskers were twitching. She loved to sunbathe. Sighed Plum. With her eyes closed, she could imagine it was summertime, and the bees were buzzing lazily around the blackberry bushes. She was so dreamily daydreaming, in fact, she didn't even hear Keeker come up. Keeker brushed Plum off as fast as she could. It wasn't easy. Plum still had most of her thick winter coat and was as woolly as a bear. "Why are we in such a hurry?" Plum grumped. Keeker was busy muttering to herself. "There's some weird old lady up there, and no one even cares." "Plum," whispered Keeker, looking both ways to make sure no one was around. "I think that the old lady up at Crabapple Hill farm might be a witch. I think it's up to us to check it out." "A witch?" thought Plum. Humph. She wasn't at all sure she wanted to go someplace called Crabapple Hill farm, especially since it was such a good day for sunbathing. Then again, it did sound a bit sneaky, and Plum loved to be sneaky. As Keeker and Plum hurried down the road, there was only one thing on their minds. How would they get up to Crabapple Hill without being seen? "We should go through the woods," thought Plum. It was way too early for fiddleheads, but there might be some berries left over from last summer, hiding underneath the snow. Yum, thought Plum. But Keeker had a better idea. If they cut through Mr. Dolan's cow fields, they'd come out right behind the barn at Crabapple Hill. "Woohoo!" said Keeker out loud. She was trying to pump herself up so she wouldn't be scared. "Boo," grumped Plum. "If they went that way, there would be no berries, only cow pies." Keeker hopped off Plum and looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then she opened the gate to the cow pasture, led Plum in, and hopped back on. Schluck, schluck, schluck. The cow field was way muddier than Plum's pasture. In fact, it was downright gross. And suddenly, they were surrounded by cows. Plum was a little nervous. She didn't like all the hot cow breath. "Shoo," said Keeker, waving her crop at them. She didn't seem nervous at all. Plum huffed and puffed as they climbed the hill. The cows didn't seem to mind. They mooed and bobbed their heads as Plum and Keeker trudged by. Finally, they got to the top, and there, standing right in front of the path into the woods, was a bull. A big, mean-looking bull with a ring in his nose and everything. Chapter 4. Keeker took a big, deep breath. Her heart was wumping and her mind was racing. What should she do? How would they get by that big old bull? This happened to her and her mom before when they'd been out riding, and her mom always just calmly rode around the bulls. "Okay, Plum," said Keeker, "just ignore him. He won't bother us if we don't bother him." They made a wide circle around the bull and hurried into the woods. "Phew," said Keeker. She was so relieved she felt as if she might faint. Dumb old bull, thought Plum. Now that they were past him, he didn't seem so scary. They went just a little way until they hit a falling down stone wall. On the other side of the wall was the messiest, muddiest barnyard Keeker had ever seen. Crabapple Hill farm. Surely only a witch would live here, Keeker thought. She could just imagine all the spells and potions bubbling away. Keeker climbed off Plum and hunkered down behind the stone wall. She tugged on the reins to see if she could get Plum to hunker too. "Ponies don't bend like that," snorted Plum. So instead, Keeker tried a disguise. She picked some branches and tucked them into Plum's bridle. From where they were hunkering, Keeker and Plum could clearly see the house, and the barn, and off to the side, a little falling down shack. The shack had a chimney with smoke coming out of it. It had tiny little windows. It was too small to be a house and way too small to be a barn. "Aha," thought Keeker, "that must be a cauldron in there, cooking over a fire." She thought of some especially creepy witches she had seen in a play. Bubble, bubble, toil and trouble. Suddenly, squeak! The screen door at the back of the house swung open and an old lady came out carrying a kettle. She had wild gray hair and was wearing a kooky skirt and a couple of coats. A big hairy dog snuffled along behind her. Laughing and cackling, the old lady walked right by where Keeker and Plum were hiding and disappeared into the shack. Keeker's heart started whumping again. Even Plum couldn't quite believe her eyes. "She's totally a witch," whispered Keeker. "I've never seen anyone who looked so kooky. And did you see that dog? It was huge. I think it might have been a wolf." The old lady stayed in the shack for what seemed like forever. Keeker's knees were wet and her back hurt from hunkering. Plum was uncomfortable too. The branches in her bridle were starting to feel very pokey. And even though she didn't like to admit it, she was very afraid of wolves. Keeker began to think of all the scary stories she'd read and stories about kids alone in the woods with witches. What was that old lady doing in there? What exactly was in that cauldron? "Yikes," said Keeker softly to herself. Now she was really scared. Even Plum started to shiver a little bit. Just then, squeak! The crooked door on the shack swung open and the old lady came out again, with the big dog right behind her. She hurried past Plum and Keeker, humming to herself, but the big dog did not hurry past. In fact, it stopped right in front of Keeker and Plum. "Oh no," thought Keeker miserably, but it was too late. The big hairy dog was climbing over the falling down wall and coming right for them. "Help!" Keeker shrieked. "Woof! Run!" She grabbed Plum's reins and scrambled over the wall, with Plum scrambling right behind her. They sprinted across the barnyard with the huge wolf panting right behind them. Chapter 5. Keeker had no choice but to dash inside into the house, sliding on a rug and almost tumbling into the coat closet. Plum went clattering into the chicken coop, sending feathers flying and making all the chickens flap and squawk. The huge wolf dog skidded to a stop and began to lick its paws. Inside the house, Keeker burst into the kitchen and got the surprise of her life. There, sitting at a little yellow table, was her mom, eating pancakes. "Keeker," coughed Mrs. Dina, startled. "What on earth are you doing here?" "Mom," panted Keeker, "what are you doing here? Why are you eating pancakes at a witch house?" Mrs. Dana just laughed. "Oh, Keeker, honestly." "What's this about a witch?" said the old lady, coming up through the kitchen door. Up close, she didn't look very scary. Her kooky skirt had big flowers all over it, and she had pink cheeks and twinkly eyes. Keeker, this is our new neighbor, Mavis Yardbottom," said Keeker's mom. "She's been making maple syrup, and she invited me over to taste the first batch." "Pancakes, hun?" asked Mavis Yardbottom, bending over Keeker with a big stack of flapjacks. Keeker felt very, very silly, especially since the pancakes were delicious and Mavis was as nice as she could be. After they'd all had seconds and thirds and rescued Plum from the hen house, Mavis took them out to see the sugar shack. "This is where the magic happens," Mavis said happily. "This is where I boil the tree sap to make the maple syrup." There was obviously nothing scary in the sugar shack, just vats of sap bubbling away and turning into sweet-smelling syrup. Since Plum hadn't gotten any pancakes, Mavis gave her a maple sugar candy, which was just as good. The big dog got one too. "His name is Clancy," said Mavis, patting him on his hairy head. "Isn't he a sweetie?" He was sweet. He didn't even mind when Plum nosed over and ate his candy too. That night it rained again, but it wasn't a cold, clattering kind of rain. It was more gentle. Ping, ping, ping. Plum curled up in her stall, licking her lips. For once, there was no mud in her whiskers, just maple sugar. Keeker fell asleep with her hands still syrup sticky. As usual, she had only pretended to wash her hands before dinner. Up on the hill, the old falling down house didn't look so scary anymore. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Mavis' yard bottom was tucked in under her favorite quilt, and next to her bed, the big hairy dog snuffled and snored. Smoke from the sugar shack spun up into the sky, blanketing the woods like cotton candy. Everyone slept soundly, and everyone's dreams were extra sweet. Thank you guys so much for joining us this week. We hope you have a wonderful and safe holiday weekend, and we'll see you again next week.